I'm Jay Elias, General Legal Counsel at Dyer-Lake Funeral Home in North Attleboro. Welcome to this episode of Live and Learn, a series of programs designed to be informative, educational, and upbeat, and always intended to enhance and encourage our personal wellness and awareness. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United Colonies of North America and to the Republic. The United Colonies of North America. That was the name used in 1775 and 1776 by the Second Continental Congress for the newly independent nation consisting of the original 13 colonies. Currency displayed the name the United Colonies, and the nickname, as it were, was used when referring to the collective colonies before the Second Congress convened. In a letter published in 1775 in the Boston Gazette, John Adams used the phrase, the United Colonies, and the members of the Second Continental Congress referred to themselves as delegates of the United Colonies. The same year, they appointed George Washington as the General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. It wasn't until September 9, 1776, that Congress formally used the name the United States of America in place of the United Colonies of North America. In their congressional declaration, the delegates wrote that in all continental commissions and other instruments where heretofore the words United Colonies have been used, the style be altered for the future to the United States. And of America? Interestingly, the reasoning behind the name America has been for years the subject of dispute among historians. Most of us learned when we were school children that our country was first discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, having sailed the ocean blue. So why isn't our nation called the United States of Columbus? Instead, our nation was named in honor of Amerigo Vespucci for his discovery of what he believed to have been the mainland of the New World. There's no question that Christopher Columbus made a monumental discovery when he showed the Europeans how he successfully sailed across the Atlantic to reach land. And similarly, one of Amerigo Vespucci's great contributions was to show Europe that the land Columbus had found was not Asia, but a new world. We were taught that when Columbus set sail in 1492, he was seeking new routes to the East Indies for trade reasons. Most of us probably remember being taught it was the fact that Columbus feared his vessels and he would fall off the edge of the earth because the planet was flat. So, once he reached a certain point in the ocean, off he would fall. It seems, though, that as early as the 6th century BC, in fact, scholars, including Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Euclid, wrote about the earth as a sphere. Historians say there's little doubt that the well-educated in Christopher Columbus's day knew very well that the earth was round and not flat. And not only that, but it seems Christopher Columbus himself owned a copy of a textbook entitled Geography, which was written at the height of the Roman Empire some 1,300 years before he set sail. And among other earlier published books, they discussed the earth's shape as a sphere. One book, in fact, was called The Sphere, and it was written in the early 1200s. So it appears that the big question for Christopher Columbus really wasn't whether the earth was flat and he was going to fall off of it, but the size of the Atlantic Ocean he was planning to cross. During 4 separate trips that started with the one in 1492, Columbus landed on various Caribbean islands, including the Bahamas. He also explored the Central and South America coasts, but he didn't reach North America, which had long been inhabited by Native Americans, and he never thought he had found a new continent. Historical records and artifacts in Newfoundland also support the proposition that Scandinavian expeditions to America predated both Amerigo Vespucci and Christopher Columbus. So hold that thought. In May of 2003, the U.S. Library of Congress completed the purchase for $10 million of the only surviving copy of the first image of the outline of the continents of the world as we know them today. That image or map is known as the 1507 Waldseemüller map, named after a German mapmaker and cartographer. The map was housed for more than 350 years in a 16th century castle belonging to the family of a German prince. That 1507 map is also known as America's birth certificate, and for good reason. It's the first document on which the name America appears. It's also the first map to show a separate and full Western Hemisphere, and the first map to depict the Pacific Ocean as a separate body of water. That map reflected the modern world in light of exciting news arriving in Europe from various explorations across the Atlantic and down the African coast, sponsored by countries like Spain and Portugal. It undoubtedly created quite a stir in Europe, since that map's findings significantly departed from accepted knowledge of the world at the time. To today's eye, the 1507 map appears remarkably accurate, but to the world of the early 16th century, it was a significant departure from the way the world was viewed. So, as for Columbus and Vespucci, it's apparent that the mapmaker and his colleagues recognized Christopher Columbus's voyages of exploration and discovery, and also the work of Amerigo Vespucci, detailing his 4 voyages across the Atlantic to America between 1497 and 1504. Vespucci concluded that the lands reached by Columbus in 1492 were indeed a segment of the world, a new continent previously unknown to Europe. And so, because of Vespucci's revolution of what he called a new world, he was honored by the mapmakers with the use of his name for the newly discovered continent. By the way, only a few years later in 1513, when the mapmaker and other scholars published their new maps and texts, they removed the name America, suggesting that even they had second thoughts about honoring Vespucci exclusively for his understanding of the New World. In the 1513 atlas, the area that had been named America on the 1507 map was instead referred to as Terra Incognita, or unknown land. But by then, the name America had stuck. The 1507 map with the name America imprinted on it is permanently displayed in the Thomas Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. And Columbus Day celebrations in the United States, meant to honor the legacy of the man credited with discovering the New World, are almost as old as the nation itself. But for many years now, a growing number of states have begun to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, a holiday meant to honor the culture and history of the people living in the Americas, both before and after Columbus's arrival. Originally celebrated primarily by Italian immigrants in the United States since 1792, Columbus Day became a national holiday in 1937 with a proclamation by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to commemorate the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas. And by proclamation on October 11, 2021, President Biden recognized Indigenous Peoples Day, honoring America's first inhabitants and the tribal nations that continue to thrive today. By the way, more than 100 cities have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, including Seattle, Los Angeles, Boston, Denver, Phoenix, and San Francisco. And by the numbers, the USA is made up of 50 states. Can you name them? Plus more than a dozen territories. Can you name them? And the first state was Delaware in 1787. The last state to join the Union? Hawaii, 1959. Some more numbers about our country? There are over 164,000 miles of highways in the National Highway System. There are more than 4 million miles of public road network. The United States, it's home to more than 300 million people living in more than 19,000 incorporated cities, towns, and villages. And of those cities, towns, and villages, more than 14,000 of them have populations below 5,000 people. More than 300 cities are considered to be medium-sized, with populations of 100,000 or more. And only 10 American cities have populations of greater than 1 million people. Those 10 large cities in order of population are New York City, by far the most populous city in the United States with more than 8.8 million residents across the boroughs of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Number 2, Los Angeles, California. LA is the second most populous city in the United States with nearly 3.9 million residents. But LA County has over 10 million residents living in what is the most populous county in the country. Number 3 is Chicago, Illinois, the third largest city in the United States and the economic engine of the Midwest, with a population of about 2.75 million residents. Fourth largest, Houston, Texas. According to the 2020 survey and census, Houston is the largest city in Texas and the fourth largest city in the United States with more than 2.3 million residents. And that brings us to number 5, Phoenix, Arizona. This city has surpassed Philadelphia since the time of the previous census, and so Philadelphia is now number 6 in the most populated cities according to the 2020 census, with a population slightly above 1.6 million people. Coming up to number 7 is San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio experienced significant growth from the time of the 2010 census, growing from about 1.3 million to 1.4 million over the last decade. Number 8 largest city in the country is San Diego, California, known for its temperate weather. Its population is about 1.4 million people. Number 9, Dallas, Texas, with more than 1.3 million people living there. Dallas is also the 9th largest city in the United States and the 3rd largest city in Texas. And the 10th largest city in the United States, San Jose, California, with about just a little over 1 million people calling it home. And calling it home, well, by the way, who calls the United States home? Who is the average American? According to the author of a book called The Average American, The Extraordinary Search for the Nation's Most Ordinary Citizen, the average American can name all 3 stooges, but cannot name all 3 branches of the federal government. Lives within 3 miles of a McDonald's. The average American has no ambition to be famous. The average American believes nature is sacred or spiritual, yet spends 95% of their time indoors. The average American consumes 55 gallons of soft drinks a year and eats peanut butter at least once a week and 3 pounds of it in a year. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, since 2000, the national median age of our country, that's the point at which half the population is older and half is younger, that's increased by 3.4 years. The average median age is 38.8 years. And the state with the youngest median age at 31.8 years, that's Utah. The state with the oldest median age is Maine at 44.7 years. Regionally, the Northeast was the oldest in 2021 with a median age of just over 40 years, followed by the Midwest, the South, and the West, which experienced the largest increase in age to 37.7 years. Here's one for you. In 2021, there were about 164 million males in the United States, up from about 103 in 1972. And in that same year, 2021, the female population in our country was about 167 million women, an increase from about 106 million in 1972. There were 4.2 million women aged 85 years and older in the United States, compared to 2.4 million men at the same time, a ratio of almost 2 to 1. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, adult men and women in America are roughly an inch taller than they were in 1960. Unfortunately, they're also more than 25 pounds heavier on average. The average height of a man between the ages of 20 and 74 increased from just over 5 feet 8 in 1960 to 5 feet 9.5 inches, while the average height of a woman the same age increased from slightly over 5 foot 3 inches in 1960 to 5 feet 4 inches. Unfortunately, the average weight for men aged 20 to 74 rose dramatically from 166 pounds or so in 1960 to over 190 pounds in 2002 to almost 198 pounds on average in 2021. And the average weight circumference for a man, that's now more than 40 inches. That's the belt size. The average weight for women the same age increased from 140 pounds in 1960 to the average of 164 pounds in 2002 to more than 170 pounds in 2021. And think about this. According to a recent Gallup poll of more than 1,000 American adults, their weight remained roughly the same as the previous year, with more than 40% saying, quote, they believe they were overweight. Just over 1/2 saying their weight was about right, and a very small percentage believing they were underweight. And in that same poll, fewer than half of the adult Americans who said they wanted to lose weight said they were actually seriously trying to do the right thing. Going back a bit to the 1920 census, that's 1920, not 2020, 85% of men over the age of 14 were in the labor force. Compare that with about 70% over age 18 today. Manufacturing workers averaged 55 hours a week, and the American workplace had a fatality rate of 61 deaths for every 100,000 workers. That's about 30 times greater than today. 1920, life expectancy for a man was just shy of 54 years. And for women at the time, 1920, it was a bit less than 55 years. Yikes. Although the last couple of years have actually seen a decline in life expectancy for Americans, due in part to the coronavirus and to an increase in both homicides and drug overdose, a girl born in the United States in the year 2020 can statistically be expected to live to be more than 80 years old, and a boy born in 2020 will statistically be expected to live to be just shy of 74.5 years of age. And although now we see new technological advances almost weekly, it was just 100 years ago when only a lucky few Americans saw an automobile or an airplane, a washing machine, a radio, even a refrigerator. The first TV stations first started appearing in America in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it wasn't until the 1930s before American television sets were widely produced and released commercially. One thing that has been around since the days of the colonists and the early settlers is the fact that Americans have long enjoyed a drink or two. Alcohol wasn't just a beverage in those early days. Among other things, it was often the first medicine a physician prescribed. And drinking alcohol, well, it was something of a means of survival. That's in part because safe drinking water was scarce in colonial times. Most available fresh water carried harmful diseases, and for colonists, drinking water meant potentially risking their lives. And so even a child drank a kind of ale, a very mildly alcoholic hard cider and molasses combination, often known as ciderkin. In those early days of our country, Americans drank alcohol in quantities we today consider nothing short of astounding. In 1790, for example, Americans drank just a bit less than 6 gallons of alcohol a year, mostly in the form of beer, cider, whiskey, and ale. By 1830, the average American over the age of 15 years consumed nearly 7 gallons of alcohol a year. That's 3 times as much as we drink today, which, by the way, is a bit more than 2 gallons of alcohol a year per person. And that's an average. In the mid and late 1800s, while many Americans were drinking more, others were sounding warnings about the dangers of drink. Some religious groups began to express concern about excessive drinking. And the country, well, it saw the emergence of hundreds of temperance groups and organizations preaching moderation and abstinence from distilled spirits. And so by the late 18th century, support for prohibition and a total ban on the manufacture and sale of alcohol surpassed the more moderate temperance sentiment. In October 1919, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act. It was also known as the Volstead Act, and it laid out rules for enforcing a ban on alcohol and defining the types of alcoholic beverages that would be prohibited. And that led to the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified on January 16, 1919. And so it was that America went dry at 12 o'clock midnight the following year, January 17, 1920. But true to our fine American traditions, it was only a few minutes later, that same day, that 6 masked bandits with pistols emptied 2 freight cars full of whiskey from a rail yard in Chicago, while another gang stole 4 casks of grain alcohol from a government-bonded warehouse, and another gang hijacked a truck carrying whiskey. And one of the unintended consequences of Prohibition was a steep decline in the amusement and entertainment industries. Restaurants failed because they couldn't make a profit without legal liquor sales. Theater revenue dropped. The closing of breweries, distilleries, and saloons led to the elimination of thousands of jobs. Barrel makers, truckers, waiters, to name just a few. But maybe the most profound effect of Prohibition was on government tax revenues. Before Prohibition, many states relied heavily on excise taxes in liquor sales to fund their budgets. In New York, for example, almost 75% of the state's revenue was derived from liquor sales and liquor taxes. And once Prohibition came around, the revenue was lost. It was reported that at the national level, Prohibition cost the federal government about $11 billion in lost tax revenue. And the cost to enforce the laws, it's estimated to be more than $300 million. And although the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages, it didn't outlaw the possession or consumption of alcohol. And there were enough loopholes and quirks to open the door to a slew of avoidance schemes. For example, one of the legal exceptions to Prohibition was that it permitted pharmacists to dispense whiskey by prescription for a host of ailments, from anxiety to the flu. So bootleggers quickly discovered that running a pharmacy was a perfect front for their trade. And in New York State alone, the number of registered pharmacists tripled during the Prohibition era. And Americans were also allowed to obtain wine for religious purposes. So the 1920s and early 1930s saw a huge increase in enrollments at churches and synagogues. Here's one. Grapes were a hot commodity in the 1920s and 1930s. Shipments of brick-shaped packages were sent from California all around the country with a very interesting and very specific warning label that read, quote, "After dissolving the brick of grapes in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days, because then it would turn into wine," close quote. The grape bricks were sold with something of a wink and a nod, and they were even included flavors like burgundy, sherry, and port. That's because home winemaking during Prohibition was completely legal. A loophole in the law allowed people to make and consume up to 200 gallons of wine in their home. That comes out to be a little more than 2.5 standard-size 750 milliliter bottles a day, every day, for every household in the country. Clearly that was yet another unintended consequence of Prohibition, but a testament to American creativity. I have one. Do you know that the motto of the United States is, "In God We Trust"? On July 30, 1956, 2 years after securing the phrase "under God," which was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, President Eisenhower signed a law officially declaring "In God We Trust" as our country's official motto. The addition of "In God We Trust" to our currency was believed to serve as a constant reminder that our nation's political and economic fortunes are tied to its spiritual faith. You undoubtedly know that our national anthem is the Star-Spangled Banner, and its author was Francis Scott Key, who was inspired to write the poem Defense of Fort McHenry, when he saw the American flag flying above Fort McHenry after American soldiers fought off an attack by the British during the Battle of Baltimore. And it was adopted as our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, more than 100 years later in 1931. But you're not alone if you don't remember all the words to the first verse of the national anthem. Did you know there are actually 4 full verses? And each one ends with the line, "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." So, a survey of more than 2,000 people found that most Americans don't know all the words to the first verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. And of those who claim to know all the words, less than 40% actually know it follows the line, "Whose broad stripes and bright stars." Well, that would be, "Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming." Here's a quick question. Star-Spangled Banner. Do you know what spangled means? If you thought about it, you probably would. It means to be decorated with beads, jewels, or other adornments. In this case, the banner, the flag, is spangled with stars. And we have a national mammal. That's the American bison. Although North America used to be teeming with herds of roughly 40 million bison, just 100 years ago, the American bison was on the verge of extinction. So as far back as 1905, Theodore Roosevelt, well, he was among a group who formed the American Bison Society to help save the bison from extinction. It was the first national effort to save an American wildlife species. By the way, before that, in 1872, Yellowstone National Park and the U.S. Department of Interior had begun protecting its remaining bison. Today, through immense collaboration with a host of partners, millions of acres of land managed by the U.S. Department of the Interior support more than 10,000 bison living in 12 states in our country. So to honor this iconic and resilient animal, Congress passed the National Bison Legacy Act on April 28, 2016, making the American bison a U.S. symbol of unity. And in 2016, President Obama signed the act into law, designating the bison as the official mammal of the United States. We also have a national tree. That's the mighty oak. The oak tree was voted our country's favorite tree in a 2001 National Arbor Day poll, securing over 100,000 votes compared to the runner-up with 81,000 votes. That would have been the redwood. Rounding out the top 5 finishers were the dogwood, the maple, and the pine tree. So in November 2004, Congress passed legislation designating the oak as our national tree, and the act was signed into law by President George W. Bush. It was praised for its diversity, with dozens of species growing in the United States. If I say the national bird, you probably know that it is the bald eagle, whose role as a national symbol is linked to its 1782 appearance on the Great Seal of the United States. Despite its symbolic significance, America's majestic national bird has also faced a real-life threat of extinction. In the late 1800s, the country was home to 100,000 nesting bald eagles. In 1940, Congress passed the Bald Eagle Protection Act, making it illegal to possess, kill, or sell the birds. And then a new threat arose when these eagles began eating prey contaminated with DDT, a pesticide that came into wide use following World War II. And by the 1960s, there were only around 400 breeding pairs left in the continental United States. And so in 1978, the bald eagle was put on the endangered species list. Thanks to federal protections as well as regulations involving the use of DDT, in 1995, the bald eagle population recovered enough to be changed from endangered to threatened, and by 2007, it was removed completely from the lists. National flower. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan declared the rose as our national flower in a ceremony that took place naturally in the White House Rose Garden. President Reagan's proclamation read in part that more often than any other flower, we hold the rose dear as the symbol of life and love and devotion, of beauty and eternity. We see proofs of this everywhere. The study of fossils reveals that the rose has existed in America for age upon age. Our first president, George Washington, bred roses. The White House itself boasts a beautiful rose garden. We grow roses in all 50 states. We decorate our celebrations and parades with roses. Most of all, we present roses to those we love, and we lavish them on our altars, our civil shrines, and the final resting places of our honored dead. For the record, fossil specimens of roses actually date back 40 million years and can be found at Colorado's fluorescent fossil beds. Consider this. The Coinage Act of 1792 requires that all coins minted in the United States have an impression emblematic of liberty, along with the inscription of the word liberty and the year of coinage on the obverse side of every coin. The obverse side? Well, obverse means the heads side, which is considered to be the front of the coin, and the reverse side is the tail side or the back side, which leads to the question of heads or tails. The act of flipping a coin to determine one of two possible outcomes has been around for centuries, although in ancient Rome it was seen as a game of chance referred to as heads or ships, because of the depiction of an emperor's head on one side and a ship's bow that appeared on early coins. Whatever it may have been called, the coin toss has continued to be used for the same purpose, to settle a dispute or to make a decision when one can't easily be made. From football games to politics, the coin toss has become a fixture in everyday life. By the way, according to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the coin toss in professional American football dates back to 1892, and a specially minted coin is made exclusively for each Super Bowl coin toss. Political candidates have even been elected based on a coin toss, and at least one well-known city was named as the result of a coin toss. Portland penny. An 1835 American copper penny was used in a 1845 coin toss to name the new city of Portland, Oregon. It seems that sometime around 1843, two New England developers, one from Boston, Mass., and the other from Portland, Maine, had each established a land claim in Oregon where ocean-going vessels could easily anchor. At the time, the village was simply called either the Clearing or the Village. The two developers determined that their growing village needed a name, something better than the village. So over dinner one night, they agreed to a 2 out of 3 coin toss to determine that name. Not surprisingly, and not too creatively either, the chosen name would be either Boston, Oregon, or Portland, Oregon, depending on who won. Seems pretty clear that Francis Pettygrove of Portland, Maine won, which explains why we have both Portland, Oregon and Portland, Maine. And on a completely different note, a recent article in a French travel journal about traveling to our country provides a laundry list of helpful advice, including this for French traveling to America. Quote, Americans feel no humiliation about their eating habits, even when asking for a doggy bag. Americans eat and drink anything and at any time of the day, in the street, in a meeting at work, in the car, on the subway, in the elevator, the movies. So there are drink rests everywhere, cinema seats, baby strollers, shopping carts at the supermarkets, in cars, some bike handlebars. And the article goes on to say the portions are often gargantuan in the United States. Americans aren't embarrassed to ask for a doggy bag to take home food. And it goes on to warn the French who are visiting America that they should keep calm in all circumstance, since some states authorize the carrying of weapons. And then there's this bit of advice according to a frequent traveler and the author of, quote, French children don't throw food. And it's this: a child is rarely considered an equal in France, whereas in America, children are frequently treated like little princes and princesses who are always adorable and can do no wrong. And so the author advises that to avoid insulting American parents and American animal owners, one should always, quote, rejoice in the presence of children or pets while in America. This is the same as the principle of smiling to strangers. It is obligatory to make a smile or a ruffle on the head if you meet a child or a pet, and I quote, even if they are ugly. I'm Jay Elias. Thank you for watching this episode of Live and Learn. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to your joining me again for another program designed to enhance and encourage your wellness and awareness. Until then, remember, it's never too late to learn. And for the record, the last 3 lines of the 4th verse of the Star-Spangled Banner are this: "And this be our motto, and God is our trust, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave."